The F-22 Raptor is such an incredible piece of engineering that it's hard to convey its impact on modern military aviation without sounding like I'm Billy Mays trying to sell you a stealth blender. When the Raptor first took to the sky in 1997, it was much more than just America's latest air superiority fighter. It represented a fundamental shift in the way the world's most powerful militaries even perceived fighter aircraft, or how they could be employed. The F-22's stealth and sensor-fusing avionics made it an unparalleled airborne hunter, so capable that one test pilot described flying against F-15 Eagles, the most prolific air-to-air fighter of the past century, as like playing football against a team that couldn't see him. But because of its stealth, which it's worth noting has still yet to be matched by any serial production fighter on the planet, people often tend to overlook the Raptor's genuinely mind-boggling brute force performance. But the truth of the matter is, the F-22 Raptor's game-changing Pratt & Whitney F-119 turbofan engines, combined with an aerodynamic design meant to balance supersonic performance against its low observable design requirements and incredible aerobatic capabilities, resulted in a jet that would still be a dominant air combat force even without the stealth that Raptors have come to be known for. It is that powerful, that maneuverable, and that capable. And as incredible as the Raptor specs might be on paper, I am here to tell you that the paper only tells half the story, because there is mounting evidence in the public sphere to suggest that the Air Force has, well, never been completely honest about what the F-22 Raptor is actually capable of. So let's talk about the F-22 Raptor's nearly 3 decades of domination. And before we're through, let's see if we can't figure out just how powerful this jet may actually be. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Today, it's genuinely hard to appreciate just how revolutionary the F-22 Raptor actually was when it first started flying in the mid-90s. From our vantage point here in 2026, stealth is a proven capability that has objectively resulted in higher mission success rates and fewer combat losses among both tactical and strategic aircraft. But during the Raptor's development, the left and right lateral limits of what stealth was actually capable of doing were very much still being hashed out. As one F-15 pilot turned Raptor driver Mike Dozer Shower once put it, the stealth jets that were already in service at the time, the F-117 and B-2, exercised what he called defensive stealth, meaning they employed low observability to avoid a fight altogether. The F-22, on the other hand, represented the first attempt at fielding an offensive stealth platform, meaning a jet that used that low observability to look for a fight rather than to run from one. And as crazy as it might sound today, there was a real and palpable pushback against the idea that a stealth fighter, rather than a stealth attack aircraft or bomber, could even work. In 1997, the same year the first F-22 started flying, the U.S. Naval Institute published a piece by retired E-2C Hawkeye Squadron Commander Jeff Huber, who described the F-22 program as, quote, a house of cards, and even went on to say, and I quote, stealth aircraft may have radar and infrared detection avoidance characteristics, but they can't evade the human eye in broad daylight any better than any other aircraft. Before he went on to say, a stealth fighter can't do much existing tactical aircraft can't already do. The Project on Government Oversight followed suit in 2000, publishing a scathing review on the Raptor's intended capability set, penned by fighter mafia alumni and retired Air Force Colonel Everest Riccioni, that made the argument, and I quote, the few F-22s possessing quasi-F-15 performance will degrade the air superiority capability of the Air Combat Command. You, you really can't make this stuff up. And it shouldn't surprise us that the promise of a revolutionary leap in air combat capability was met with so much skepticism from the old guard. It's a story as old as time, as those with a well-established mental framework for how the world works buck against the idea that the world might change and render that framework outdated. We usually call this cultural inertia. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that all critics of emerging technologies are opposed to progress, but I am saying that being opposed to progress is, broadly speaking, fairly common among those whose sense of self is rooted in the way things currently are or the way things used to be. So, with no shortage of heavyweight critics and looming political controversy over cost, there was a huge amount of pressure on a small group of handpicked pilots and maintainers from the 27th Fighter Squadron when they arrived at Exercise Northern Edge in Alaska with a dozen brand new Raptors in February of 2006. Now, this massive joint force exercise would be the F-22's first chance to prove itself against a combined adversary force of F-15s, F-16s, and F-A-18s, supported by the powerful radar arrays aboard E-2C Hawkeyes and E-3 airborne warning and control aircraft. You probably know them as AWACS. Now, when all was said and done, the Raptor-led Blue Force had scored 241 air-to-air kills over the combined fighters of the Red Force, with that Raptor side losing just 2 aircraft, both F-15Cs that flew alongside them into the fight. In strict terms of F-22 engagements alone, they left that exercise with a notional air combat record of 108 wins and 0 losses. In fact, the F-22s were wiping adversary jets off the board so fast that the Air Force started allowing Red Force fighters to depart the battle space after they were blown up to regenerate and then come back in just to keep the exercise going. Now, just a few months later, the F-22 made its debut at Red Flag, the Air Force's premier large-scale air combat exercise. Now, this time, Raptors weren't just squaring off against the best Uncle Sam had to offer, but cadres of British and Australian jets as well. And the results were the same. Royal Australian Air Force Squadron leader Stephen Chappell flew against those Raptors in an American F-15C as an exchange aggressor pilot. And when the exercise was over, he did not mince words. I will quote him directly. "I can't see the thing. It won't let me put a weapon system on it, even when I can see it visually through the canopy. Flying against the F-22 annoys the hell out of me." Now, he later went on to describe it as a humbling experience. Of course, air combat exercises aren't actually very productive for anybody if one side just decimates the other from 50 miles out over and over and over again. So once the Raptors' dominance had been established, exercises began to shift to make sure pilots on all sides actually gained valuable experience in different sets of circumstances. Today, F-22s are known to fly within visual range dogfight exercises while still carrying their performance-hindering drop tanks under wing. Though, when I asked F-22 pilots about this common facet of dissimilar air combat training with other nations, every one of them that I asked told me very plainly that they had no comment. Maybe the best evidence, then, of the Raptors' peerless performance in the sky is how far and wide any story of victory over any Raptor in any exercise spreads. And if you want proof of that, just look in the comments under this video, where you will be sure to find people talking about how 2 German Eurofighter Typhoons managed to score notional kills against drop tank carrying F-22s and close quarters exercises over Alaska more than 14 years ago now. They can't tell you how many bouts the Raptors won, and they don't care. All that matters is that in those 2 instances, Raptors lost. People have this strange notion about warfare that good platforms or good systems can never lose, and that just isn't realistic at all, especially when we're talking about a training environment. I can attest to that not only from my time in the Marine Corps, but also from my cage fighting days. The best fighters that I ever trained with lost constantly in training because they were intentionally finding ways to continue to challenge themselves. And that's also exactly why the US always stacks the deck against its own forces in war games and large-scale combat exercises, because you don't get better when everything goes your way. But I do need to be clear that it wasn't just the Raptor stealth or even its sensor-fusing avionics that made it so frustrating to fly against. While those capabilities might garner the majority of headlines, there was another technological achievement tucked under the F-22's radar-absorbent skin that American adversaries in places like Russia and China in particular are still trying to match, some 36 years after it was first fielded. And that is the incredible power production and efficiency of the Pratt & Whitney F-119 turbofan engine. Now, we've talked about these engines a bunch of times on this channel before, but I don't think I can overstate what a big deal they were. Pratt leaned on previous developments derived from the US Army's Advanced Turbine Engine Gas Generator program to inform their turbine fan blade shaping for optimal efficiency. And then they turned to the Joint Technology Demonstration Engine program to find ways to reduce the number of stages required for the same power output. And as a result, their revolutionary new engine design reduced the number of compressor stages from 10 in earlier turbofans like the F-100 to just 6, allowing for a 22% increase in afterburning thrust in an engine that's comprised of 40% fewer parts. The F-119 design's multivariable linear quadratic regulator control system allows for extremely precise engine control across practically all flight conditions, maximizing both efficiency and performance in every flight regime, at least as much as possible without adaptive cycle technology. And while not often seen as sexy enough to talk about in articles, these engines also came with a proactive management toolset and new reliability tracking systems, like inline oil debris monitoring sensors to assess engine wear in real time to further streamline and reduce maintenance and repair requirements. Now, these engines' 3-zone afterburners placed their fuel injectors in thick curved vanes, meant to block line of sight to the turbine. And then those vanes were coated in ceramic-based radar-absorbent materials to reduce radar detectability while still withstanding all that heat. The engine nozzles, which offer 20-degree thrust vectoring for pretty incredible aerobatic performance, along with greater control at high altitudes and more effective flying at high angles of attack, used wedge-shaped flaps to reduce their radar return, while also facilitating the active mixing of that outgoing engine exhaust with ambient air to reduce heat or infrared detectability as well. Now, when we talk about the amount of power a fighter jet produces, we tend to talk in terms of maximum thrust under afterburner. And that makes perfect sense when you're talking about superlatives. And in that regard, the F-22 was indeed the most powerful fighter on the planet, with more afterburning thrust on tap than even the SR-71 Blackbird at a reported combined total of 70,000 pounds of thrust. That may even be enough to still hold the title of most powerful fighter today, though China may be edging the Raptor out in that regard with their new WS-15 engines and their latest production J-20s. But in air combat reality, fighters aren't flying under full afterburner very often at all, because, well, in simple terms, afterburners are just dumping fuel into the outflowing exhaust of your engines to create more thrust. At full afterburner, most modern fighters will burn through every drop of fuel they've got on board within just a few minutes. So instead, what really tends to matter in a fight is what pilots call military power, or the maximum amount of thrust your aircraft can produce without its afterburners engaged. And it's in that lesser discussed metric that the Raptor F-119 combination really shines. You see, the Raptor's fancy new engines did offer a genuinely substantial 20 to 22% increase in afterburning thrust over earlier turbofan designs. But in terms of non-afterburning or military power thrust, it delivered an unprecedented 53% jump, while also enabling supercruise capabilities, or the ability to fly at supersonic speeds without even having to use the afterburner at all. In fact, according to the Air Force's standards, supercruising doesn't start until Mach 1.5, while every other nation on the planet considers it to start at Mach 1. Now, the F-22 Raptor produces a disclosed 52,000 pounds of thrust without its afterburners. And to give you a sense of how much power that is dumping out the back of this aircraft, that means the Raptor is more powerful without its afterburners than the F-15, F-16, F-A-18, or F-35 with their afterburners at full tilt. In fact, the F-22 Raptor has been known to supercruise under military power at speeds higher than Mach 1.8. That means the Raptor can best the afterburning top speed of the F-35 without even using its afterburners at all, and it can maintain Mach 2 at just 118% power, or using about a third of its afterburning thrust. And I think it's worth emphasizing that point for a minute, because I think we all get a bit desensitized to talking Mach numbers because of how frequently we talk about maximums and theoretical limits. The F-16, for instance, is rated for a maximum speed of Mach 2.05, but anybody who's ever clocked in a day's work in a Viper's cockpit will tell you that the jet's never going to see anything close to that unless you strip it down and fly it to its hairiest limits. In fact, in a fantastic piece F-35 pilot Hazard Lee wrote for us at Sandboxx News, he talked about taking a stripped-down F-16 out on a top-speed shakedown run with no pylons, no weapons, no external fuel tanks, or sensor pods to slow it down. At 50,000 feet, he put the jet into a shallow dive and leaned all the way into the afterburner. And by the time he hit Mach 1.6, the jet was starting to shake, and he had real fears that it was going to come apart around him. But he continued to accelerate through it, ultimately reaching as high as Mach 1.9, before he almost ran out of both fuel and altitude. The F-22 Raptor's chief test pilot, James J.B. Brown III, described hitting Mach 2 in the much faster F-15 as, quote, very uncomfortable, with its turbofans starting to struggle to gulp down enough air to keep accelerating, and the jet's control surfaces starting to falter in the thin atmosphere at the altitudes required to reach those speeds. The F-15 may well hit Mach 2.5 when flying totally clean, but credible sources suggest it's really limited to around Mach 1.78 in a missile-packed combat configuration. The F-22 Raptor, on the other hand, can go from a dead stop on the runway to Mach 1.7 at 60,000 feet in about 3.5 minutes, and it'll reach Mach 2 about 30 seconds after that. Once there, JB described the Raptor as like, quote, riding in a limousine or like flying first class in a 787. He said he spent more time flying supersonic in a month flying the Raptor than he had in his entire test pilot career before it. Now this, of course, has a lot to do with those incredible F-119 turbofans, but importantly, it also has to do with the use of those internal payload bays to minimize radar return, as the aircraft effectively flies naked or without any drag-inducing pylons, weapons, or external fuel tanks to slow it down. And it was actually watching footage of JB recounting his time in the F-22 that got me wondering what the Raptor actually is capable of, rather than what the Air Force says it's capable of. As we've talked about on this channel before, the Air Force fact sheet for the F-22 Raptor lists the platform's service ceiling simply as above 50,000 feet, but it is widely understood to be able to achieve altitudes of 65,000 feet or better. Now, when I directly asked F-22 pilot and commander of the 19th Fighter Wing, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Loco Lopez, just how high the F-22 can actually fly, the only thing he'd tell me was higher than any other fighter. Likewise, the F-22 is rated for a disclosed top speed of Mach 2.25, but there's also considerable evidence to suggest the machine itself is certainly capable of flying faster than that. Now, this, of course, is not isolated to the Raptor, but it's rather an example of a long-standing American military tradition of understating technical capability in the public sphere. The SR-71 Blackbird may be among the most famous examples of this, as it regularly exceeded its stated service ceiling and maximum speed ratings. We've even got a whole video all about it. And spending just a few minutes in a conversation with just about any U.S. Navy submariner will leave you with the distinct impression that most of the performance specs that are released regarding Virginia, Seawolf, and Ohio-class, heck, even Los Angeles-class subs, are all more like pessimistic fan fiction than actual accounts of what they're capable of. The B-2 Spirit is another great example, with its publicly stated maximum payload of 40,000 pounds, despite regularly operating with two 30,000-pound bunker busters tucked in its payload bays, up until Operation Midnight Hammer last year, when the Air Force realized, well, they were going to have to update that fact sheet based on all the news coverage. Now, it's important to understand, though, that part of the reason for this delta between real and claimed performance of military platforms comes down to a long list of environmental and circumstantial factors, ranging from simple things like the amount of fuel it's got on board and how much that weighs, to far more complex things like the shifting atmospheric conditions experienced by aircraft as they rapidly climb through different layers of the atmosphere at different speeds. That is to say that the B-2's max payload may genuinely be 40,000 pounds with a maximum fuel load, but by carrying less than its capacity of 167,000 pounds of fuel, it can increase the amount of payload stowed inside in exchange for more frequent mid-flight refuelings. In other words, you can trade maximum range, one disclosed metric, for maximum payload, another disclosed metric, making neither actually static figures. And that means national governments have to make decisions about how they want to present military platforms when they disclose these kinds of capabilities. Because every piece of equipment comes with that kind of nuanced understanding of what it's actually capable of doing, but the public expects concrete figures that evoke feelings of confidence or pride, or at the very least, a rational economic policy. Some nations, then, as a result, might lean into the most optimistic edge cases when making claims about their military capabilities, like when Russia famously claimed that their faux hypersonic Kinzhal missile had a range of over 3,000 kilometers, only to later reveal that that's because they also included the combat radius of a Tu-22 M3 backfire bomber that would carry and launch it. In reality, the bomber represented 2,500 kilometers of that 3,000-kilometer range, and the missile itself is believed to only reach around 500 kilometers under its own power. Of course, even calling Kinzhal a hypersonic missile in the first place was, of course, an intentional exaggeration of the weapon's capabilities for the sake of publicity. And on the other side of that spectrum, Uncle Sam really often seems to prefer to toe the line between making sure other nations know that American hardware is potent and capable, but while often only disclosing baseline capabilities, like what the platform is certain to be capable of, even in the worst situations, or just disclosing the previously established requirements for a system as the platform's final specs, rather than actually disclosing the platform's performance as determined through testing. And the F-22 Raptor is certainly no exception to this general communication strategy. Its F-119 engines, for instance, are commonly cited as good for a maximum of 35,000 pounds of thrust under afterburner, a fact that is all but certainly derived not from operational testing, but from the stated requirements of the Advanced Tactical Fighter Engine program that it emerged from, which mandated a minimum of 35,000 pounds of thrust from each engine, which was an increase from the original requirement of 30,000 pounds, which was based on a lighter fighter design. And that understanding tells us right off the bat that 35,000 pounds of thrust under afterburner might be all the F-119 is capable of, but from an engineering standpoint, that 35,000 pound figure was a minimum the engines had to be able to reliably meet, not a circumstance-specific maximum achievable only in the right conditions. And that's why you'll often see these engines described as 35,000-pound thrust class engines, because that figure isn't a theoretical maximum, it's the general category of power output that they fall into. And to that point, Air and Space Forces magazine published an interview with Pratt & Whitney's executive director for the F-119 program, Carolyn Cooper, who overtly described the Raptor's F-119s as generating more than 35,000 pounds of thrust as recently as just last year. And for the record, that piece also directly cited the F-22's ability to operate at altitudes, quote, above 65,000 feet. Now, I want to be clear that we're splitting hairs for the sake of conversation here, but in 1990, Pratt's vice president for the F-119 program, Walter Bilsu, and I apologize if I mispronounced that, told Aviation Week that their prototype YF-119 was already producing 20% more thrust than the ATF engine full-scale development specifications required. Now, that statement came after the thrust requirements for these engines were increased from 30,000 pounds to 35,000. But for the sake of argument, let's say he was referring to that original 30,000 pound thrust requirement. That would still place the YF-119's maximum thrust output at roughly 36,000 pounds. Then, in 1998, the book Advanced Tactical Fighter to F-22 Raptor, Origins of the 21st Century Air Dominance Fighter, explained that the maximum thrust increased by another 10% during the transition from the prototype YF-119 design to the operational F-119 turbofan. And that would have increased the max thrust rating for these engines to 39,600 pounds. And with that in mind, Bill Sweetman's 1998 book, F-22 Raptor, also stated that the Raptor's engines are, quote, likely good for up to 39,000 pounds of thrust. Broadly speaking, I do think it's unlikely that the Raptor's F-119s are consistently capable of achieving 40,000 pounds of thrust or more, because that 40,000 pound mark became the target for the F-135 engine derived directly from the F-119 that would ultimately power the F-35. But the possibility that the Raptor is actually capable of dumping between 37,000 and 39,000 pounds of thrust from each engine in the right conditions does not sound crazy to me at all. So that means we really can assess with some confidence that the F-22 Raptor is indeed capable of producing more than 70,000 pounds of thrust in the right set of circumstances. And when I say circumstances, I'm mostly talking about environmental conditions. Temperature and altitude, as a really important example, both have a direct impact on oxygen density in atmospheric air. Just like talking turbochargers or superchargers on forced induction cars, cool air is more oxygen dense and thus can help you provide more power in internal combustion engines. Of course, at higher altitudes, air becomes thinner, counteracting some of that temperature drop, and then you have to consider other variables like ram drag created by that fast-moving air hitting the engine inlet and the turbine, and on and on and on. High-performance jet engines, you probably won't be shocked to learn, are super complicated when you get into the nitty-gritty of it. But for the sake of argument, let's say the F-22 really could muster 39,000 pounds of thrust from each engine, or a total of an absolutely insane 78,000 pounds of thrust. So how fast would that make the Raptor capable of achieving? Well, in order to discuss that, we'll actually first need to briefly discuss the fact that Mach speed ratings are relative, based, believe it or not, on temperature. Sound travels faster through warm air, so the higher you go, the lower the speed of sound becomes, though the temperature drop does start to level out at around 36,000 feet. Now, famed F-22 test pilot Paul Metz reportedly claimed that the Raptor could exceed 1,600 miles per hour at altitude, which would only be around Mach 2 at sea level, but at 65,000 feet, which is where the Raptor would be flying at altitude, that would actually shake out to around Mach 2.42, well over its stated top speed of Mach 2.25. And to that point, a group of Virginia Tech aerospace engineering students took Lockheed Martin's published aerodynamic performance data for the Raptor and used it to calculate the aircraft's maximum supercruise speed and notional maximum aerodynamic speed, or the point in which the engine's thrust would no longer be able to overcome the force being exerted by the air the jet has to push through. Now, their analysis assessed that the F-22 Raptor is capable of supercruising under non-afterburning military power at Mach 1.82, which pretty exactly matches test pilot accounts and suggests that these engineering students were on the right track. And when it came to calculate how fast the Raptor could actually fly with its 35,000-pound plus thrust class engines and its aerodynamic design, they came up with a pretty surprising figure: Mach 2.8 at 65,000 feet. But does that mean the F-22s out there on the flight line today could actually fly Mach 2.8? Frankly, no, almost certainly not. First and foremost, those higher engine thrust ratings of 37,000 pounds or 39,000 pounds came from bench testing rather than testing in an actual aircraft. And just like testing the crank horsepower of your V8 versus dyno testing the car that you put that V8 in, functional power output is not the same as bench testing power output. Once installed in a fighter, just like that V8, these turbofans have to deal with the parasitic loss that comes from things like inlets that were only designed for specific speed regimes, bleed air being extracted for avionics cooling and cockpit pressurization, power leaching from accessory gearboxes, and lots more. These engines likely do produce a lot more than 35,000 pounds of thrust, but by the time they're done powering everything else that they need to power, they probably come down to right around that 35,000 pound figure. And there are lots of things beyond thrust versus aerodynamic drag to consider when it comes to top speed runs, including additional weight, like a combat payload, and maybe most pressing in the F-22 specifically, the temperature tolerance of its radar absorbent skin. You see, the F-22 Raptor is coated in a relatively fragile, older layer of polymer-based radar absorbent material, or RAM, that genuinely sustains damage when exposed to prolonged heat and friction. That's pretty part and parcel for flying fast. When that damage requires repair, removing old RAM is a toxic and time-consuming process. Then the new RAM coatings have to be carefully applied before letting that jet cure for days before it can fly again. And that's actually a big part of why the Raptor has such high operating costs and such low readiness rates. Now, this problem has largely been mitigated in more modern stealth aircraft like the F-35, which have their radar absorbent materials baked directly into the composite structure of their body panels. But to upgrade the Raptor to that, we would need to restart production of Raptor body panels, and that certainly wouldn't be cheap. So long story short, a pilot might actually be able to push their F-22 beyond Mach 2.25, maybe even all the way up past Mach 2.4, as some test pilots have clearly done. But doing so very well could cause costly damage to the aircraft's RAM coating, and depending on circumstances, it could even damage the aircraft itself. And in reality, the difference between flying at Mach 2.2 and Mach 2.4 in a fight is fairly negligible, meaning there's not a lot of reason for a pilot to push their luck, even if the flight computer would allow it. So, the F-22 may indeed be capable of flying faster than its stated top speed. In fact, I'm certain of it. But I think the more important takeaway from this analysis is that it broadly doesn't need to. The Raptor's top speed may be lower than the top speed reported for jets like the F-15 or the MiG-25 or the Su-27, but objectively speaking, the speeds that it's capable of actually achieving in combat are actually way higher than those allegedly faster jets. And if you were choosing between fighters that you were going to have to fly into combat, which would matter more to you? How fast a jet could theoretically go on paper, or how fast it could actually go in a fight? Because the Raptor didn't become the king of the sky by chasing superlatives for superlative's sake. It became the king of the sky by delivering the right capabilities that you need to win a fight. Paper be damned. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. Now, I don't have good news on the Android version of our Sandboxx News app just yet, but I promise you that our team is actively working on it. But in the meantime, it is still available on iOS, and I really recommend that you check it out. Lately, I've been working on a series of Defense Tech 101 infographics that are about to become in-app exclusives, along with our long-form interviews and lots more to come. Again, all the stuff that you're used to seeing from me will still be in all the places that you're used to seeing it. We're just adding new stuff into the app alongside our written defense news and analysis and all of our video content. Now, if you got anything out of today's video, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, and don't forget to leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, make sure to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.